The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar complaint as Danielle Ross pushed through the double doors of Sacred Heart's emergency department at 6:19 a.m. Norfolk humidity hit her like a wall, thick, invasive, the kind that made old wounds ache. Her scrubs were still damp from the parking garage rain. She didn't notice. Her hands moved through the familiar choreography, badge clipped, hair pulled back, surgical trays reorganized before the day's shift properly began. The tray arrangement made the resident who'd worked nights do a double take. "You move these?" Some were in the wrong order, Danielle said quietly, adjusting a 14-gauge angiocath needle into its slot with the precision of someone who'd done this in sandstorm conditions. Combat triage sequence. Airway. Circulation. Control. Exposure. The hospital protocol was different, but her hands remembered Bagram more clearly than they remembered Norfolk. She didn't meet the resident's eyes. The ER smelled like antiseptic and floor wax and the particular staleness that came from a night shift that had run too long. Danielle moved through the controlled chaos with the kind of invisibility she'd cultivated for 3 years. Competent. Quiet. Forgettable. The civilian nurse who occasionally made residents feel inadequate without ever saying a word. It was safer that way. Smaller. Buried. She was restocking the crash cart when she heard it, a fragment of conversation in the break room, voices pitched low but not low enough. "Did you hear? Marcus Ross made the teams. SEAL Team 3. Captain just mentioned it." Danielle's hand stopped. 1 second. 2. The vial of epinephrine hung suspended between her fingers. "Wait, like our Marcus? The quiet maintenance guy. His mom works here somewhere. Nursing, I think. Never talks about him." Danielle placed the vial in its slot. Her face remained blank. The tremor that wanted to travel through her shoulders, she didn't let it. Not here. Not where someone might see and ask questions. Marcus had made the teams 3 months ago. He'd called her that night. She'd cried alone in her car for 40 minutes. He hadn't mentioned his commanding officer. There was no reason he would. That part of her life was supposed to be dead. The overhead speaker crackled. Incoming trauma. ETA for minutes. Single patient, male, shrapnel wounds, conscious on scene. Fire and rescue report significant lacerations to the right lateral abdomen and upper arm. Danielle's jaw tightened. Shrapnel. Not a car accident. Not a fall. The kind of wound that came from a place where people were trying to kill you. She moved toward the trauma bay without being asked, her feet taking her where she needed to be before her brain had finished catching up. 2 residents were already gowning up. Nurses were running, checking ventilators, pulling blood draw supplies, confirming the O-negative was thawed and ready. The organized panic of a system that had done this 1,000 times before but never knew if this time would be the one where precision meant the difference between a patient going home and a body going to the morgue. The ambulance bay doors burst open like a mouth swallowing. The stretcher came through at speed, the paramedic calling vitals with the clipped efficiency of someone who'd done this so many times the words had lost all inflection. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, Navy, vital stable on scene but trending. BP 118/76, heart rate 102, respirations 18 and regular, O2 sat 94 on 2 liters, GCS 15, conscious and oriented ×4. They wheeled him into Trauma Bay 3. Danielle was already there, already moving, already seeing what the residents were still processing. The shrapnel pattern meant a directed blast, not random IED fragmentation but something shaped, something calculated. The right side of the abdomen and upper arm meant the blast had come from his left, probably from above. He'd been standing when it happened. Maybe turning. The wounds were deep but not arterial yet, which meant the bleeding had slowed or the paramedics had applied pressure correctly. "Let's get him on the monitor." 2 large bore 4s. "I want labs, type and cross, trauma panel. Get an ultrasound over here." One of the senior residents was already barking orders, falling into the role of command like he'd been born for it, which he probably had, the kind of person who'd always been told he was special. Danielle was setting up the first full line. Her hands moved like they belonged to someone else, muscle memory made flesh. Find the vein. Anchor it. Slide the needle through the skin with the kind of confidence that came from doing it 500 times in conditions that had actual bullets involved. The catheter seated clean. She taped it down and reached for a second line before anyone had to ask. Hayes was watching her. Even through the pain, even with the paramedic still removing his jacket to assess the full extent of the wounds, his eyes tracked her movements. "You're good at that," he said, his voice rough but steady. The voice of someone trained to remain functional under trauma. Military. Navy, based on what the paramedic had said. Like you've done it before. Danielle didn't answer. She was already moving, already assessing. The real damage was in the lateral abdomen. The shrapnel had torn through muscle, possibly into the peritoneal cavity. Without imaging, it was impossible to know if he had internal bleeding, if there was damage to the small bowel, if his spleen or kidneys had taken shrapnel. The ultrasound would tell them in seconds. Fast protocol. Focused assessment with sonography for trauma. Danielle had run this assessment in a forward operating room with mortars impacting 200 meters away. But it was the moment Hayes lifted his left arm to help the nurses with his vest that she saw it. A single dog tag. Broken chain. The metal was scarred, tarnished, and the stamping was worn, but the unit designation was clear enough for her to read. The same unit design from the operation that had been erased. The operation that had ended her career and buried Major Danielle Ross under 3 years of false civilian credentials and carefully constructed invisibility. The room didn't tilt. Her training didn't allow it. But something in her chest fractured in a way that had nothing to do with medicine. She looked away. She didn't have a choice. Looking was recognizing. Recognizing was dangerous. Across the trauma bay, Dr. Harrison Caldwell stepped through the doors with a chart in one hand and coffee in the other, still wearing the comfortable authority of a man who'd never questioned whether the world belonged to him. His eye swept the room, trauma protocol, standard assessment, resident competence being evaluated, and then his gaze landed on Danielle. More specifically, it landed on the exact spot where her attention had just fled from. The dog tag. Hayes. Her face. Caldwell's coffee stopped halfway to his mouth. His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition. Not of Danielle, he was looking at her like she was a piece of equipment that had suddenly malfunctioned. But he was looking at Hayes with the kind of intensity that only came from a man who understood exactly what that dog tag meant. Exactly which operation. Exactly which people had been there when things went wrong. His jaw moved slightly, as if he was working through a calculation. The ultrasound technician was already here, already running the probe across Hayes's abdomen, and the screen lit up with the kind of images that usually required interpretation. But Danielle could see them clearly enough. No free fluid in the abdomen. No blood pooling around the spleen. No obvious injuries to the kidneys. The shrapnel had been vicious but measured. If it had been 2 inches to the left, Hayes would be coding. 2 inches to the right and he would have lost his arm. His stable, the senior resident announced, relief loosening his shoulders. No active bleeding. We're going to need CT to confirm, but based on what I'm seeing, he might not even need the OR. Hayes closed his eyes. Someone who'd been thinking about how much worse it could have been was allowing himself permission to relax. Clean him up. Get him to CT. The resident was already moving on, already moving past the moment of crisis into the administrative phase where his competence would be measured by efficiency rather than instinct. I want the CT cleared before the next trauma comes in. Danielle was already pulling supplies, already preparing for the cleaning phase, already moving in the way a person moves when they've been trained to function without processing what their body had just understood. She'd seen the dog tag. Caldwell had seen her see it. Hayes had no idea that the woman standing next to him right now had spent 5 hours once in the same village where he'd probably spent worse. The rain started while she was cleaning the shrapnel wounds. She could hear it on the windows of the trauma bay, not gentle, but demanding, like it had something to prove. The smell of it came through the ventilation, mixing with the antiseptic and the copper of blood still drying on the gauze. "You know what I love about CT?" Danielle said quietly, and Hayes's eyes opened, tracking back to her face. "You get to leave. Everyone leaves. Someone else's problem for an hour." It wasn't quite humor. It wasn't quite a complaint. It was just the truth, stated so plainly it sounded almost like kindness. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. Something passed across his expression, recognition of a different kind. Not of who she was, but of what she was. What kind of person moves that calmly through crisis? What kind of person feels nothing while watching shrapnel come out of skin? "You military?" he asked. Danielle was wrapping his arm in a clean dressing. "Just a nurse." But Caldwell was still standing in the trauma bay, not moving, not leaving, watching the exact moment she lied. And the moment Hayes accepted the lie, because that was easier for both of them than asking questions that could only be answered by people who'd been at Bagram. The next morning, Hayes's room filled with voices, his wife settling into the visitor's chair, their teenage daughter clutching a coffee cup from the hospital cafe, the kind of morning that looked like family support and tasted like a setup. Danielle entered with the vital signs clipboard, her movements precise, economical. She'd learned long ago that every motion should communicate competence. Caldwell was already there, standing at the foot of the bed like he'd been waiting for an audience. "Lieutenant Commander, how are we feeling today?" Danielle's voice was steady. She checked the fall line, noted the dressing around his shoulder wound. No inflammation. Good color to the tissue. She began writing observations on the chart. "Nurse Ross." Caldwell's voice cut across the room like a blade. "Did you actually assess capillary refill last night, or are you just guessing?" She didn't look up from the clipboard. One measured breath. "I assessed at 2,300 hours. 2-second refill. Normal range. 10 words. Clinical. Documented. Because I'm looking at your chart notes, and they're vague." Caldwell stepped closer, angling his body toward Hayes's wife and daughter. "Theater. This was theater. I need competence, not imagination. The shaky nurse shouldn't be on critical cases, should she?" The waiting room went quiet. Danielle could feel the silence pressing against the observation window. Other staff members had paused in the hallway. They were listening. That was the point. Hayes's wife shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Their daughter stared into her coffee. Danielle's hand steadied. Not because she was calm. Because she'd trained them to be steady under fire, and this was just a different kind of fire. She set the clipboard down with controlled precision. Met Caldwell's eyes. Saw the fear there beneath the contempt, the terror of a man watching his past walk toward him wearing scrubs. "Fear makes people do ugly things, Doctor," she said quietly, wiping away a single tear without breaking her gaze. "Ugly things they think nobody notices." She turned and left the room with perfect military posture, each step deliberate, measured. Behind her, the waiting room exhaled. Hayes shifted in his bed. His wife's hand found his. 2 hours later, Danielle was moving through the unit when she saw the write-up posted on the bulletin board beside the staff schedule. Her name was there in black type, in Caldwell's precise handwriting, emotional instability and poor clinical judgment observed. Recommend administrative review before patient reassignment. The words felt designed to carry, positioned where every person entering the break room would see them, pause, read them, judge. She didn't stop. Didn't stare. Just registered the coordinates of her own character assassination and kept walking. That afternoon, she sat down in the break room with a sandwich she wasn't going to eat. The room smelled like burnt coffee and the plastic-wrapped staleness of microwaved leftovers. 3 veteran nurses were gathered at the far table, the ones who'd worked here longer than she had, who'd always nodded in the hallway. One of them glanced at the bulletin board. Then at Danielle. then at the others. They gathered their lunches without speaking. Left without a word. Within 90 seconds, she was alone at the table, the only sound the fluorescent light's almost imperceptible hum and the hollow tick of the clock above the refrigerator. Her sandwich sat untouched. The isolation was clean, efficient, professional. Just like everything else Caldwell did. That evening, Caldwell made the move she'd been waiting for. During the staff meeting, he announced the shift changes in his usual tone, conversational, reasonable, nothing to object to. Danielle's name came up third. Permanent night shift rotation, effective immediately. New assignment, records documentation, file management, minimal patient contact. The reassignment was clinical, bureaucratic, impossible to fight without sounding defensive. Without sounding unstable. But that wasn't the worst part. When she tried to pull Hayes's chart after the meeting to review his post-op progression, the system locked her out. Restricted appeared in red text on her screen. No reason given. No authorization code. Just locked. She sat back in her chair. Understood immediately what Caldwell had done. He'd restricted her access at the database level, the kind of move that required administrator credentials. The kind of move that said he wasn't just protecting himself. He was afraid of what she might find. What he might find if she found it first. That night, Danielle drove home through Norfolk's rain-slicked streets, the kind of rain that fell in sheets and refused to let up. Her hands ached from the tension of keeping them still all day, and her chest felt hollow with the weight of inaction. She understood Caldwell now. Understood that he'd been at Bagram too, that he'd been present for whatever operation had buried her commission, her rank, her identity under classified seals so deep that the Pentagon itself pretended she didn't exist. And he was terrified she'd remember his face. The drive home took 40 minutes. She parked in her driveway and sat in the darkness for a long time, engine off, the rain hammering the roof like something trying to break through. Her phone buzzed. Text from Marcus, her son, just 3 words that would echo through her entire next shift: "Commander Hayes is asking for you." She closed her eyes and didn't respond. But that wasn't the message that mattered. What mattered was the one Marcus sent an hour later, while she lay awake staring at the ceiling of her darkened bedroom. "Mom, his vitals have been unstable for 2 days. Dr. Caldwell won't let anyone touch his treatment plan. I think something is wrong." Danielle stared at those words in the blue glow of her phone screen. Caldwell's face. The dog tag around Hayes's neck. The unit insignia that shouldn't exist anymore. 3 years of erasing herself, and now the past had walked through her ER, broken and bleeding, wearing a chain with proof that she'd been real once. That she'd mattered. And Caldwell was going to bury him next, not from malice, maybe, but from panic. From a man trying to protect himself by protecting his secrets. She thought about the oath she'd taken when she became a nurse, separate from the one she'd taken at 18 when she'd raised her right hand in front of a commanding officer and promised to protect and defend. Separate, but the same. The rain continued against the windows. She was going to have to choose. Again. Her phone rang at 11:44 p.m. Danielle was in her kitchen, still in scrubs, staring at a cup of coffee she'd made an hour ago and forgotten to drink. The number on the screen was Sacred Heart's charge nurse line. She answered on the first ring. Hayes's coding. Maya's voice cracked like fractured glass. BP crashed 20 minutes ago. We can't get a rhythm. The on-call surgeon is 20 minutes out, stuck in traffic on IE-64. Danielle was already moving toward the door. What does the echo show? Caldwell refused to order one. He said Hayes was stable 2 hours ago, said the crash cart team was overreacting. He's in his office. A monitor wailed in the background, the distinctive pitch of asystole. He's been down for minutes, Danielle. We need someone now. The line went dead. Or Danielle dropped the phone. She wasn't sure which because her hands were already muscle memory, already combat ready, already reaching for her keys as her mind ran through field thoracotomy steps she hadn't performed since Bagram, since sandstorm conditions and enemy fire, since the operation that had buried her alive in a civilian identity. She drove back to Sacred Heart at 127 miles per hour, rain hammering the windshield like shrapnel pinging off a convoy. 13 minutes. That's what she had. 13 minutes before brain death began. 13 minutes before a Navy SEAL flatlined because a cardiologist was too afraid to order a diagnostic test. Too afraid because he'd been at Bagram too. Because whatever Caldwell had done in that dust, whatever choice he'd made in that operating theater, he couldn't risk her connecting the dots. The ER entrance doors hissed open at 12:04 a.m. The charge nurse was waiting. Her face told Danielle everything. Trauma Bay 3. He's been down 6 minutes. 2 residents doing compressions, they're exhausted. But Dr. Caldwell stood in the doorway of Trauma Bay 3 like a sentry at Hell's Gate, blocking the entrance with his body and his authority and his institutional power. His face went pale when he saw her. "You're not on shift, Nurse Ross. You need to leave this facility immediately." His voice carried the weight of a man who'd already made phone calls, already prepared his alibis, already decided that a dead SEAL was acceptable collateral. "Security will escort you out." Behind him, the monitor showed asystole. A flat black line. The sound it made was wrong, a steady electronic hum with no rhythm, no hope, no heartbeat. The charge nurse shouted from inside the bay, "He's been down 6 minutes. Where's Caldwell?" Caldwell didn't move. Didn't even glance backward at the flat line. He kept his eyes on Danielle, and in that moment, she understood the calculus perfectly. He'd rather let Hayes die than have her walk into that trauma bay and prove him wrong. Prove that he'd missed the cardiac tamponade. Prove that his negligence had killed a man. Prove that a nurse, a night shift nurse, a woman he'd systematically destroyed, was better than him when it mattered. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Danielle felt it in her shoulders, her jaw, her hands, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world has to offer. She'd held dying men's organs in her hands before. She'd performed emergency procedures in shipping containers turned into field hospitals. She'd made peace with death itself. She looked at Caldwell the way she might look at an obstacle in a hallway, something to be moved, nothing more. "Step aside," she said. His jaw clenched. "I'm ordering you to leave Sacred Heart immediately. This is your final warning before I call security and have you removed for trespassing." "He's been down 7 minutes." The resident's voice was breaking now. "We're losing him." Danielle took 1 step forward. Caldwell held his ground. His breathing had changed, shallow, fast, the respiration pattern of a man watching his world collapse in real time. His hands were clenched into fists, which meant he'd considered the option and rejected it. He wouldn't lay hands on her. Couldn't. Not in front of witnesses. Not with a flatline monitor as evidence of his failure. So she simply moved through him like water through a sieve. She didn't push hard. She didn't need to. She walked forward and Caldwell stepped backward, 1 foot, 2 feet, his hands rising as if to block her and then dropping because they both knew what would happen if he tried. She moved past him with the kind of terrifying fluid precision that comes from 1,000 hours of trauma work, 1,000 decisions made in rooms exactly like this one. Her jacket came off as she approached the bed. She snapped it. Betadine, scalpel, and a rib spreader from the crash cart. Now. Not a request. Commands. The residents moved like her words had rebooted their nervous systems. 1 reached for the crash cart. 1 kept compressions going, though their shoulders were shaking with exhaustion. Hayes lay on the trauma bed with his chest already exposed, with adhesive pads on his sternum from the defibrillator attempts, with 4 lines running and 2 exhausted residents trying to keep blood flowing to a brain that had already been deprived too long. His skin had gone the color of old concrete. His pupils were blown. But there was still time. There was always time if someone with the right training moved fast enough. Danielle looked at the monitor 1 more time. Asystole. No electrical activity. Which meant the problem wasn't the heart's rhythm, it was mechanical. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid around the heart, compressing it, stopping it the way a fist closes around a sponge. How long has he been down? She asked, already knowing the answer because the answer determined everything. 7 minutes, maybe 8, the resident said. We tried defibrillation twice. No response. Nothing. Danielle looked at Caldwell, who stood in the doorway watching his career end in real time. She held his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked away because he wasn't worth the oxygen, wasn't worth the distraction, wasn't worth anything except the knowledge that he'd made this choice. He'd chosen pride over a patient. He'd chosen fear over honesty. He'd chosen wrong. The betadine was cold against Hayes's ribs. The scalpel felt right in her hand, the weight, the balance, the way it had always fit her palm like it was forged for her grip. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who'd done this in sandstorm conditions while artillery thundered in the distance. Left anterolateral thoracotomy, 5th intercostal space. The blade cut through skin and subcutaneous tissue with the sound of silk tearing. Get me a cautery unit, she said. And a satin sky clamp. Now. The second resident was already moving, was already understanding that the woman in front of them wasn't a night shift nurse who'd been bullied into isolation. Wasn't someone who flinched at insults or cried in supply closets. Was someone who moved like she'd walked through fire and come out the other side harder, colder, more certain of herself than any doctor this hospital had ever produced. The monitors around the room seemed to lean in closer, as if even machines could sense that something had shifted. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer. Rain hammered the windows like distant gunfire. And in the doorway, Dr. Caldwell finally understood the truth he'd been running from since Bagram. He'd been standing next to a legend the whole time. She didn't wait for permission. The crash cart stood 3 feet away, and Danielle moved toward it like water finding gravity, no hesitation, no question, just the absolute certainty of someone who'd done this before. Betadine poured across Hayes's exposed chest, the antiseptic smell cutting through the stale hospital air like a blade. The trauma bay had gone cathedral quiet. Residents frozen at their stations. Caldwell's hand still raised in protest, suspended midair, his voice already fading into background noise because Danielle had stopped listening the moment the monitor flatlined. The scalpel felt right in her palm. Not the dull surgical blade a civilian nurse might reach for, but the sharpened titanium edge she kept in her scrub pocket, kept there for reasons she'd never written down, reasons that lived in muscle memory and scar tissue. She positioned it between the 4th and 5th ribs, her breathing steady as a metronome, her hand moving with the kind of surgical precision that only comes from having done this in sandstorm conditions with enemy fire hammering the compound walls and blood already coating your gloves from the last patient. One smooth cut. Lateral thoracotomy. The incision parted like water, and she didn't watch the residents' faces as she positioned the rib spreader. Didn't need to. She could feel the shock radiating off them like heat. A civilian nurse doesn't know how to do this. A civilian nurse doesn't have the muscle memory. A civilian nurse's hands don't move like they're reading from an invisible surgical map burned into tissue and bone. The rib spreader cranked open. Click. 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 The chest cavity opened, and there it was, the pericardial sac swollen tight with blood, a bulging membrane about to rupture, about to steal the last breath Hayes would ever take. Danielle incised it with a combat knife from her pocket, not hospital equipment, not protocol, just the tool she'd carried since Bagram, and blood poured out like releasing pressure from a containment vessel. The monitors began climbing. She didn't have time to notice. Her hands moved into Hayes's chest cavity, both palms open, fingers finding the heart beneath layers of tissue and gore. The muscle felt like holding a small animal trying to escape. She began compressions, not the weak, uncertain movements of someone following a textbook, but the deliberate, controlled physical massage of a surgeon who'd held lives in her hands while helicopters circled overhead and the radio screamed casualty reports. The rhythm was automatic. 2 fingers here, pressure there, feeling for the electrical pulse that never came. Across the trauma bay, Caldwell's face drained to something like chalk. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again without sound, because he finally understood. This wasn't nursing. This was combat surgery. This was the precision of someone who'd worked under fire, who'd improvised with whatever was available, who'd saved soldiers with field triage and adrenaline and the kind of knowledge that only comes from having already seen the worst humanity can do. Clamp the descending aorta, Danielle said. Not a question. Not a request. A command, delivered in a voice that had been buried for 3 years under the quiet deferential tone of a woman pretending to be less than she was. A resident scrambled forward, hands shaking, and found the clamp. The aorta secured. Danielle continued compressions, 30 seconds of manual massage, her palms working against Hayes's silent heart, asking it to remember how to beat. 20 seconds. 30. The monitor remained a flat line. 40 seconds. And then. A blip. Single electrical pulse. Irregular. Dangerous. But alive. Another compression. Another blip. The rhythm returned, erratic at first, then solidifying into the blessed pattern of sinus rhythm. Hayes's heart beat under her hands, under the hands of Major Danielle Ross, United States Army Medical Corps, combat surgeon, the woman they decided to erase and pretend had never saved anyone at all. The trauma bay erupted in a sound like collective exhaling, like 16 people simultaneously remembering how to breathe. Danielle stepped back. Her hands were shaking now for the first time, not from fear, not from the adrenaline, but from the collision of two identities suddenly occupying the same moment. The nurse. The major. The invisible woman. The legend. Hayes's blood coated her palms, dark and real and evidence of something no civilian hospital was supposed to witness. The heart monitor beeped. Steady. 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 Alive. Within 53 minutes, Caldwell had made 17 calculated phone calls. The hospital administrator. The nursing board liaison. Security. His lawyer, twice. Each conversation surgical in its precision, designed to manufacture a narrative that would make this moment disappear. She practiced beyond scope. Unauthorized surgical intervention. Violation of patient autonomy protocols. Danger to hospital liability. Each phrase carefully chosen to sound clinical, professional, untouchable. By the time security arrived at the trauma bay entrance, Danielle's hands had been cleaned, but the blood still lived beneath her fingernails. She watched the guards approach, not running, not urgent, just the quiet determination of people following orders they'd been given. No explanation. No opportunity to defend. Just the slow mechanics of institutional power grinding forward. Her badge went into the plastic tray at the security desk. The ID card her only name. The keycard that opened emergency exits and supply closets and the lockers where she'd hidden the pieces of herself that didn't fit into the civilian identity. They took it all, and nobody said a word about the life she'd just saved, the surgical miracle that had happened in Trauma Bay 4, the fact that without her, without that impossible knowledge, Hayes would have been dead in 90 seconds and nobody here would have been able to stop it. You'll need to turn in your parking pass, the security guard said. Not unkind. Just following procedure. Just doing his job. Just participating in the machinery that was designed to erase her a second time, in a cleaner way, a quieter way, without classified files or government oversight, just the quiet removal of someone who knew too much and could do too much and didn't fit into the carefully arranged world of normal. The parking garage was empty at 10:43 p.m. Just the hum of ventilation systems and the drip of water from a leak somewhere in the concrete infrastructure. Danielle sat in her car, a 2014 Honda Civic with 142,000 miles, completely ordinary, completely forgettable, and turned off the engine. 1 hour passed. Then another. Forehead pressed against the steering wheel, her mind cycling through the impossible mathematics of it. She'd saved his life. That was the truth. The irreducible fact. She'd done what she was trained to do, what her hands knew how to do, what her brain had been processing in real time while part of her watched herself doing it, the nurse and the major occupying the same moment of consciousness, unable to reconcile the impossible. But she'd lost it. The identity. The only one that fit anymore. 3 years of careful deferential movement, 3 years of scrubbing away the combat surgeon and replacing it with just Danielle, just a nurse, just someone who took orders and asked no questions and didn't make people uncomfortable by being too competent, too fast, too precise. All of it erased in 90 seconds of having to save someone's life. The rain started around midnight, hammering the windshield with the kind of intensity that felt personal, deliberate. Danielle didn't move. Didn't turn on the wipers. Just watched the water distort the view of the parking garage lights, amber, red, green, distorted through sheets of water until they looked like something from a fever dream. What she didn't know was that the termination paperwork had triggered something. A mandatory background check. A protocol designed to flag any civilian with security concerns. And somewhere in the architecture of federal databases, a classified security clearance had appeared, not erased like they'd promised, not burned like she'd been told, but flagged, documented, monitored. A clearance that shouldn't exist. A record that somebody, somewhere, had kept. The Pentagon was already making phone calls. The hospital conference room smelled like fresh coffee and institutional fear. Danielle pushed open the heavy door and froze. An FBI agent sat at the head of the table in a charcoal suit, a Navy officer in dress blues beside him, medals climbing his chest like a geography of war. Marcus stood at attention, his uniform crisp, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle working. On the table lay a manila folder, edges stamped with red markings that meant classified, meant sealed, meant the life she'd buried was about to surface. The FBI agent gestured to the empty chair. Danielle didn't sit. She stood, her hand steady, watching the way Marcus's eyes tracked her face. Waiting for her to break. She wouldn't. Major Ross. Marcus's voice came out fractured, like something breaking under pressure. His lips trembled as he said the rank she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years, the rank that belonged to a woman who was supposed to be dead. The folder lay open now. Danielle reached for it without permission because permission was for people asking for things, and she had stopped asking the moment she pushed past Dr. Caldwell into the trauma bay. Her hands moved across the declassified pages. Combat medical badge. Bronze star with Valor. Her photograph, stamped confidential, hair pulled back, eyes that looked like they'd seen too much light and not enough sky. The SEAL team leader straightened in his chair. His voice came out like a command, like something that made the air in the room compress. Bronze star with Valor. He waited. Let that settle. Purple heart. Another pause, heavier now. The other officers at the table were staring at Caldwell. They were waiting to see his face. 2 purple hearts. Combat medical badge. Surgical excellence under fire commendation. His voice climbed, each word louder than the last, each decoration a hammer striking metal. And the Meritorious Service Medal. The silence was absolute. The fluorescent lights above them didn't hum or flicker, they just burned, white and clinical, the kind of light that hides nothing. Caldwell's face had gone the color of old bone. His lips moved but nothing came out. He understood now. Not just that Danielle was military. That she was decorated. That every move he'd made, every write-up, every isolation, every strategic restriction of access, had been an assault on someone whose hands had held lives together in sandstorms, under fire, while the world tried to erase her from existence. He'd been building a case against a ghost. Worse, he'd been building it against a legend. The FBI agent opened a second folder. His voice was flat, administrative, the tone of someone reading a parking violation. Dr. Marcus Caldwell. On March 15, at 2:44 a.m., you accessed the hospital personnel database using your administrative credentials. You attempted to alter Major Ross's employment file to reflect, the agent looked up, his eyes steady. To reflect a pattern of narcotic dependency. You were unaware that her civilian file is federally monitored. Everything you entered was logged. Everything was recovered. The agent leaned back. At Bagram Air Base in 2019, you were working as a civilian contractor. During Operation Clean Slate, Major Ross performed a classified surgical procedure that saved 15 lives, including 3 SEAL operators. The officer in dress blue shifted, and Caldwell flinched at the movement. You stole controlled medications from the field hospital during that operation. Major Ross was the only witness who could connect you to that theft. So when you saw her recognize that dog tag, when you realized she was the surgeon from Bagram, you made a choice. You decided to bury her again. Caldwell stood up. His chair scraped backward with a sound like fingernails on glass. I was protecting patient safety. She had no credentials to. Sit down. The FBI agent's voice made him sit. Security arrived at 7:44 a.m. 2 officers in polo shirts with radios clipped to their belts. They'd walked this corridor 1,000 times, past the break room where Danielle had sat alone while staff abandoned their lunches, past the nurse's station where her name had become shorthand for instability. Now they walked Caldwell in the opposite direction, his wrists fitted with handcuffs, his face angled toward the floor. The break room door was open. Danielle heard the gasp first, then the chair scraping back, then the nurses, the ones who'd left when she sat down, the ones who'd whispered about her trembling hands and her emotional episodes, the ones who'd believed every word Caldwell had written. They watched him pass. Their hands covered their mouths. One of them, Jennifer from the night shift, started to cry. Caldwell didn't look at them. He looked at the floor. He looked like a man watching his own funeral, understanding too late that he'd been the only mourner. In the parking lot, he tried one more time. This isn't right. I was protecting the hospital. I was doing my job. His voice had gone thin, reedy, the voice of someone who'd suddenly learned that power is temporary and very fragile. The FBI agent guided him into the federal sedan. Your job was to heal people. You chose to destroy one instead. That's not protection, doctor. That's vengeance. And vengeance looks a lot different in a courtroom. The car pulled out of the lot, Caldwell's silhouette visible in the back window, face turned away from Sacred Heart Hospital. From the nurses who'd witnessed his arrest. From the identity of the woman he'd tried to erase. Inside the trauma bay, the hospital administrator stood beside Danielle with a folder of her own. This one wasn't classified. It was printed on hospital letterhead, formal and official, offering her a position she'd never imagined, Chief of Trauma Surgery at Sacred Heart, effective immediately. Danielle looked down at the paperwork. Her name was on it. Not as nurse. As Major Danielle Ross, MD, Surgical Director. Hayes wheeled himself in, Marcus pushing the chair. The SEAL moved with the careful precision of someone still healing, still learning that his ribs were intact, that his heart was beating its own rhythm again. He looked at Danielle for a long moment. Just looked at her. Like he was trying to memorize something that might disappear. You exist in every after-action report from Bagram, he said quietly. You exist in the 32 people who went home because of you. The army needs you disappeared. We don't. Marcus gripped the back of the wheelchair, his eyes wet but his voice steady. Come back, Major. Please. She looked at her hands. Still red from the thoracotomy, the stains that no amount of hospital soap could fully remove. Hands that had saved a life. Hands that had been called unstable, emotional, incompetent. Hands that belonged to a decorated combat surgeon. I accept, she said. 18 months later, Danielle walked through the main entrance of Sacred Heart in surgical scrubs, her Chief of Surgery badge clipped precisely to her collar. The badge was silver. It caught the light. The morning shift was coming in, nurses and residents and orderlies, and they all looked up as she passed. Recognition. Respect. The kind you earned in trauma bays, not in classrooms. At the security desk sat Dr. Caldwell. He wore a blue polo shirt with the Sacred Heart logo embroidered on the chest. Night security. Minimum wage. The kind of position that made him visible to everyone he'd once supervised, visible to every person he'd tried to destroy. He'd served 8 months in federal prison for fraud and criminal tampering with medical records. His medical license had been revoked. He was 47 years old and would never practice medicine again. As Danielle approached the desk, Caldwell's eyes flicked up. Recognition flooded his face. Then shame. His gaze dropped immediately to the security monitor in front of him. He refused to look at her. Couldn't. "Doctor," Danielle said. Just one word. Just the title he no longer held. He flinched as if she'd struck him. She walked past without pausing. The trauma bay doors slid open, and her team was waiting, Marcus in his dress uniform, already a SEAL instructor, Hayes on crutches but standing, the dog tag from that broken chain now hanging around his son's neck, 3 residents eager to work under the surgeon who'd performed an emergency thoracotomy with a combat knife and won. In the break room, the nurses had saved her a seat. The bulletin board where Caldwell had posted his write-up about her emotional instability now displayed her formal appointment letter and a framed Navy commendation. The contrast was surgical. Precise. Impossible to miss. That night, her phone rang at 11:34 p.m. The White House Personnel Office. They wanted her at a Medal of Honor ceremony in 2 weeks. Not as a recipient, but as the surgeon who'd saved 3 of the 7 honorees. Her work from Bagram was being declassified. Slowly. Carefully. But declassified. Danielle sat in her car in the same parking garage where she'd broken down 6 months earlier, forehead pressed against the steering wheel, unable to reconcile saving a life with losing her identity. The engine was running now. The radio was playing something soft. She was smiling. As she drove past the security desk, Caldwell watched her leave in the rearview mirror of his position. She'd reclaimed everything. Her rank. Her credentials. Her future. And he would watch it happen every night shift for the rest of his career, understanding too late that power is not a title hanging from a hospital badge. Power is the ability to help. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like button. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.